The tail gunner position on a B-17 Flying Fortress was without a doubt the loneliest and most terrifying job in the entire bomber. Sitting in complete isolation at the very back of the aircraft, these men faced death from every direction with nowhere to run. The survival statistics were absolutely brutal. Tail gunners had one of the highest casualty rates of any crew position, and the stories of those who somehow made it back reveal only a glimpse of how horrific this job really was. We'll get to those soon, but first, let's quickly set the stage. When the United States entered World War II, it joined Britain in launching a massive joint bombing campaign against Nazi Germany. The goal was ambitious: destroy Germany's ability to wage war by levelling it from above. If they could smash factories, break infrastructure, and shut down military production, maybe they wouldn't even need a full-scale invasion to win. Allied commanders believed the war could be decided in the sky, and the centerpiece of that strategy was the B-17 Flying Fortress. The tail gunner sat in the most exposed position on the entire aircraft. Crammed into a cramped compartment at the very back, he operated two .50 caliber machine guns through a small plexiglass window. He was completely cut off from the rest of the crew, connected only by intercom. When German fighters attacked, and they almost always attacked from behind, the tail gunner was the first and last line of defense. He was also the most likely to die. The tail section was a death trap by design. Unlike other gun positions that were integrated into the main fuselage, the tail gunner sat in what was essentially a separate compartment. If the aircraft was hit and caught fire, he had the furthest to travel to reach an exit. If the tail section took damage, he could be trapped with no way out. And unlike the belly ball turret gunner who could be cranked back into the aircraft, the tail gunner had to crawl forward through a narrow tunnel while the plane was potentially spinning out of control. But the psychological horror was even worse than the physical danger. Tail gunners spent hours staring backward, watching the formation spread out behind them, scanning for the black dots that meant German fighters were coming. They saw everything. When a bomber in their formation was hit, they had the best view of the carnage. They watched aircraft explode, break apart, and spiral into the earth. They counted parachutes and knew when there weren't enough. They saw their friends die, and they knew they were next. The cold was unbearable. At 30,000 feet, temperatures dropped to -40 degrees Fahrenheit. The tail section had minimal heating, and the gunner spent hours exposed to the wind, rushing through gun ports and gaps in the plexiglass. Frostbite was common. Some tail gunners lost fingers or toes to the cold. Others passed out from oxygen deprivation when their systems failed. And all of this happened while they were supposed to be scanning for enemy fighters and ready to fire at a moment's notice. German fighter pilots knew exactly how vulnerable tail gunners were. They developed specific tactics to exploit this weakness. The most common attack was the stern chase, where fighters would approach from directly behind, using the bomber's own tail as cover until the last second. The tail gunner would see them coming but couldn't fire until they were practically on top of him. By then, it was often too late. Luftwaffe pilots also used the head-on attack, which was even more terrifying from the tail gunner's perspective. He would watch helplessly as German fighters lined up far ahead of the formation, then came screaming straight toward the lead bombers with cannons blazing. The tail gunner couldn't do anything to help. He could only watch the slaughter and wait for the fighters to circle back for another pass. The stories of individual tail gunners revealed just how horrific this job really was. Staff Sergeant John Foley was flying his 15th mission over Germany when his B-17 took a direct hit from anti-aircraft fire. The shell exploded just behind the waist gunner position, severing the tail section from the rest of the aircraft. Foley found himself trapped in the detached tail, spinning through the sky at 20,000 feet with no parachute and no way out. The tail section tumbled for nearly 4 miles before slamming into a snow-covered field in occupied France. By some miracle, Foley survived the impact. German soldiers found him barely conscious, his back broken, his legs shattered, but somehow still alive. They were so shocked to find a survivor that they immediately called for medical help. Foley spent the rest of the war as a prisoner, but he was one of the lucky ones. Technical Sergeant Robert Williams wasn't so fortunate. During a mission over Hamburg, his B-17 came under attack by a squadron of German fighters. Williams was firing at an approaching Messerschmitt when a 20mm cannon shell exploded just inches from his position. The blast killed him instantly and destroyed his guns. The rest of the crew didn't even know he was dead until they tried to contact him over the intercom. His body remained in the tail compartment for the entire flight back to England. The mental strain was just as deadly as enemy fire. Tail gunners developed what would later be recognized as severe combat stress. They suffered from nightmares, panic attacks, and what crews called the 1,000-yard stare. Some simply refused to fly. Others had complete mental breakdowns mid-mission. The isolation made it worse. While other crew members could see and talk to each other, the tail gunner was completely alone with his thoughts and his fear. Equipment failures were another constant threat. The tail gun turret was one of the most complex systems on the aircraft, with electrical motors, hydraulic lines, and mechanical linkages all crammed into a tiny space. When something broke, which happened regularly, the gunner could find himself trapped in a non-functioning turret while enemy fighters closed in. The manual backup systems were difficult to operate and often jammed at the worst possible moment. Staff Sergeant Eugene Moran learned this the hard way during a mission over Bremen. His turret lost power just as German fighters began their attack run. He tried to operate the guns manually, but the hand cranks were frozen solid. For 20 minutes, he sat helpless in the tail, while fighters made pass after pass at his bomber. He could do nothing but watch as cannon shells ripped through the aircraft around him. Somehow, the bomber made it back to base, but Moran never flew another mission. The ammunition supply was another nightmare. The tail guns carried 500 rounds per gun, but in a prolonged fighter attack, that ammunition could be exhausted in just a few minutes. Tail gunners had to ration their shots carefully, only firing when they had a clear target. But in the heat of battle, with fighters coming from all directions, it was almost impossible to maintain fire discipline. Many tail gunners found themselves completely out of ammunition with the fight still raging around them. Loading fresh ammunition was dangerous and almost impossible during combat. The ammunition boxes were located in the rear fuselage, requiring the gunner to leave his position, crawl forward, and manually load new belts while the aircraft was under attack. Most tail gunners chose to stay at their guns until the ammunition ran out, knowing that leaving their position even for a few seconds could mean death for the entire crew. The worst part was the helplessness. When bombers were hit and started going down, tail gunners had the best view of the disaster unfolding. They watched engines catch fire, wings break off, and control surfaces get shot away. They felt the aircraft begin its final dive and knew they had minutes, maybe seconds, to get out. But escape from the tail position was difficult under the best circumstances, and nearly impossible in a damaged, spinning aircraft. Technical Sergeant James Crawford was in the tail when his B-17 was hit by flak over Frankfurt. The aircraft immediately went into a steep dive, pressing him against the back of his compartment with tremendous force. He tried to crawl forward toward the escape hatch, but the G-forces were too strong. He was trapped in the tail as the bomber spiraled toward the ground at over 400 miles per hour. At the last second, the pilot managed to pull the aircraft out of its dive, but not before Crawford had accepted his death. He later said the 30 seconds he spent pinned in the tail, watching the ground rush up toward him, were the longest of his life. The bomber made it back to England, but Crawford never flew another mission. The psychological trauma was too severe. Despite all these horrors, tail gunners were credited with shooting down hundreds of German fighters. Their position, while dangerous, gave them the best field of fire for defending the formation, Many bomber crews owed their lives to the vigilance and accuracy of their tail gunners. But the cost was enormous. Of the approximately 200,000 men who served as aircrew on American bombers during World War II, tail gunners had one of the highest casualty rates. The job required a special kind of courage. These men climbed into their isolated compartments knowing the odds were against them. They faced death from enemy fighters, anti-aircraft fire, mechanical failure, and the elements themselves. They did it mission after mission, watching their friends die, counting the days until their tour was complete, or their luck ran out. When the war ended, many tail gunners struggled to readjust to civilian life. The isolation, the constant threat of death, and the trauma of watching so many bombers go down left lasting scars. Some never spoke about their experiences. Others suffered from what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. But they had done their job, protecting their crews and helping to win the war from their lonely perch at the back of the flying fortress.